All right. Good morning, everyone. Coming off the high of the college conference that we just held, it was so great. I can tell you guys, we have some of the finest young people in this church and in our call to greatness at Haskell and Baker and KU. It's just unbelievable. Just a level of faith, and we spent a lot of time talking about being a disruptor on your campus and how to fight and wrestle for a conviction, how to get a conviction, and I think it was, I know it was impactful for me, and I know that the young people were really impacted. And so I'm expecting some good things this semester. My faith is high. Um, last week, let's get started. Pastor Rick gave us a stirring message on how Jesus planted a flag at midfield on the adversary's turf. And sometimes those people aren't really like the person that was like the two or three people that come and put that flag in the middle of the field. I don't know about you guys, but I want to be that guy that plants the flag and says to the devil, "Hey, man, we're coming in. We're here. We're ready to fight." I would have been that guy, and probably then I would have got in a fight at midfield. So, he alerts the enemy, "Man, I'm here. Get ready." You might, and in that story, you might recall Jesus and three of his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, are up on Mount Hermon, and they get to see Jesus in the Transfiguration. It's a holy, powerful moment for them. Moses and Elijah supernaturally appear. Jesus' garments become shining white, like whiter than they said, like I think Rick mentioned, whiter than a launderer using high-end bleach. These three disciples get to be in the presence of the glory of God. And it sounded like they wanted to stay there. They wanted to stay on that mountaintop high experience and, build some tents and things. Um, you know, who wouldn't want to stay on the mountaintop high? You know the feeling when you go on a vacation, no worries, no concerns. You're nice to everyone. Everyone is nice to you. You get back to the real world at work and home, and things just are a little different. They're in chaos, maybe stress, shortness returns. And that's where we're starting this morning. Jesus and his three disciples come down the mountain. They've just had this mountaintop experience, and they come down, and the other 9 disciples are stirring things up. So let's get into it. We find a mess here, and before we start, I'll say you might know this, but I'll remind us that the book of Mark is the shortest, okay, of all the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the shortest, and Matthew and Luke are close to twice as long as Mark's Gospel, okay? And when Mark includes a story that Matthew or Luke tell, he usually does it in fewer words. Mark was not a man, the book of Mark is not a book of many words. But not in this account, which is interesting. Mark takes 16 verses to tell this story that took place at the base of Mount Hermon. And Mark's account is longer than both Matthew and Luke's account combined. So literally, he uses more verses to tell this story. So there's something here. Mark really wants to hit on something, and I believe he wants to point out how fragile our faith can be and how we constantly have to fight unbelief. So let's take a look at it. We'll start, and I think, Rick, we left off at Mark chapter 9, and we're going to start at verse 14. So it says, "And when they came to the disciples," so this is Jesus and the 3 others, "and they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, 'What are you arguing about with them?' And someone from the crowd answered him, 'Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able.'" So let's set the scene. We have probably the 9 other disciples that weren't up on the mountaintop with Jesus, a great crowd, and scribes. And now Jesus and the other 3 disciples arrive, and the 9 disciples and the scribes and the crowd, they're in the midst of this argument. And Jesus, like usual, asks the question, "What's going on here? What's happening?" The first to speak up is not the disciples. It's not. It's this father just of a boy, and he says the father of a boy who's been demon possessed, and he sounds disappointed and desperate. While he came to Jesus' disciples with hope, they were unable to help him, and he is clearly at a loss when he's speaking to Jesus here. Now, you might remember earlier in Mark when we probably about 6 months ago, we probably were doing this, was Mark chapter 6. Jesus sent out the disciples to preach to people that they should repent, and he gave them authority over impure spirits. And later in Mark 6, it says, in Mark 6:12-13, so they went out and proclaimed that people should repent, and they cast out many demons and anointed them with oil, many who were sick and healed them. Anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. So we know that the disciples have been having success here. They've been having success on their mission. Jesus told them to go out and do some stuff, and they went and do it. They went and did it. They're healing people. They're casting out devils. But in this situation, something isn't right. The disciples can't seem to help this father and son, and these scribes are in their face causing a commotion. Scribes, just so we get some background again, scribes were religious leaders of the day. These are men who are very knowledgeable in the Old Testament law. They would provide legal advice on how to interpret and apply Jewish laws to daily life. And in Mark, they are frequently portrayed as criticizing Jesus and his teachings. And it looks like they had probably been watching Jesus' disciples appear powerless, helping the boy, and I'm sure the scribes had more than a few words to say to them. I think they were likely telling the disciples that Jesus didn't have the power or authority to accomplish this task. Maybe they had their own idea on how this should be done, or just maybe they were denouncing Jesus and the disciples were defending him. Needless to say, I think this isn't a good situation. This isn't a good situation, and Jesus jumps in here. So in verse 19, Jesus is responding to the father. So the father had just said, hey, my son has got these demons. What's going on here? I'm desperate. And Jesus says, he answers them, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. Now, biblical scholars are mixed who Jesus is talking to here, but most tend to believe that he's talking to the disciples, actually. He's not talking to the crowd or the father, but they're there, so they get to hear this. And I think Jesus is calling out in the disciples' lack of faith. But wait a second. The disciples had faith, right? I mean, they were believing. They're following Jesus. He's calling out their faith. But they couldn't cast out this devil. What happened? Was their faith lacking? I think that's why he says, oh, unbelieving generation. Theirs was an unbelieving faith. A faith that was lacking. Why? I don't know. Who knows? Who knows? Perhaps they had become complacent and they'd done this before, so no problem to do it again. Maybe they saw their previous powers as some sort of magic, that all they had to do is go through their routine and the demon would come out. Say the right words and really, really mean it. I've kind of, as I was reading, I was thinking, what does this scene look like? Does all 9 disciples, different ones, try different things one by one, to get rid of this demon and heal the boy? Philip, back up, it's my turn. Or obviously, Thomas, you've got a problem with doubting. Let me try. They're working, they're knocking each other around. Let me try. Or they probably got to Andrew. After all, he was Peter's brother and he fails. It's like, man, what's going on? Perhaps they had misplaced faith, their faith. That is, that they were confident in their own abilities, in themselves rather than in God. They had performed the miracles because of God's power behind it. And Jesus sounds the way when I read it, I look at Jesus sounds exasperated with them. Come on, guys, get with the program. I'm tired of putting up with your weak faith. He knows that these men will soon be entrusted with this huge mission to reach the world, but at this point, they continue to be slow to learn. A lot like us. They're persistently weak in faith and their dependence on God. Let's move on in the story in verse 20. And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." When the demon sees Jesus, things get crazy. The demon clearly recognizes Jesus as the Son of God and therefore knows its power. It's completely defeated in his presence. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't get distracted. Jesus calmly continues to question the Father in the midst of this wild scene. As the Father answers, Jesus sees the weak state of the Father's faith. And he's really looking, his faith is really weak. The Father says to Jesus, "If you can do anything." He's got some weak faith here. Now, wait a second. This is, as we think about this is Jesus he's talking to. He's heard the stories, right, of Jesus and his disciples healing people. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He can do anything. This Father clearly has little faith and hope left. He wasn't absolutely convinced that Jesus could heal his son, and Jesus' response is incredible. The Father's trying to question Christ's power, and Jesus turns it on him. He turns it on him. He has a Father question his own faith, his own desire. All things are possible and will appear possible to him that believes in the power of the Almighty God. In dealing with Christ, very much is put on our believing, and very much is promised if we believe. The question isn't if Jesus can, it's if we believe he can. Jesus constantly asks the disciples questions about their belief. You might remember, "Who do you say that I am?" in Mark 8:29. "Why are you afraid, you of little faith? Do you believe that I can do this? Do you believe that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins? Do you believe that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God?" Jesus is full of questions, questioning their belief. Now, I don't believe it says you just have to have enough faith. You can have whatever, and you can have whatever you want. I don't believe that. And if you don't get what you want, it's because you don't have enough faith. That's not the point of this verse. That's not the point. The point of this verse is that God has the power to do whatever he wants through the faith of one who believes. This is not carte blanche, promise to ask for whatever you want and God will do it. Rather, it's a promise that God has the power to do whatever he wants. And Jesus is calling us to a confident faith. He's calling us to ask in faith, to ask knowing and believing that God is able, that nothing is impossible for him. So let's look at what happens. Jesus gives him this challenge to believe, and this is what it says. Immediately, the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Makes you wonder what the disciples were actually doing to cast out devils before. Once again, we hear Mark use the word immediately. I mean, we've seen that word immediately throughout the book of Mark. This father, man, he doesn't waste any time, and Mark highlights that. He knows what he wants, and the father responds to Jesus right away with one of the most remembered lines in the Bible, and a response that has aided Christians for centuries. I do believe. Help my unbelief. It's clear that Jesus has used his Father's story to draw out his doubt and unbelief. It's like he was processing the situation with the Father in front of everyone. And even for us here this morning, he uses a father's unprocessed doubts to bring him and the people around to a greater faith and belief. This father, I think, is like the everyman. We all have doubts and we need help with our unbelief. And just like we need we need help with this unbelief that we sometimes have as we go through our day to day. And just like that lesson, just like this, like right after he heals the boy, the lesson's over. The boy's healed. The disciples then question Jesus about their inability to cast out the demon. Jesus says that this type of demon can only come out with prayer, and Jesus emphasizes the need for dependence on him. If we rely on our own strength, we'll always fail. We must be a people who rely on God, and our dependence is most evident in our commitment to prayer. It makes you wonder again, like, what were the disciples thinking here? What were they doing? Were they just like, hey, devil, get out? And that, or like, and they were seeing success with this, and they just started relying on their own power. So where does this leave us? We see this story, we see where does it leave us? I think it's clear there's different groups of people here, and I'm kind of evaluating the different people. I think it's clear that the scribes in this story appear hopeless. They appear hopeless. They're stuck on religious law, and they don't even try. Aren't even trying to believe. They're not even trying. They see miracles like healings all around them, but their eyes are not open to seeing the truth. Their desire to believe is zero. Okay, it's what it appears like. They aren't trying to build faith and belief. They're trying to distract us with useless rules and traditions. And we all have people like this in our life. They dissuade us from following Jesus and say things like, trust the science, or we have always done it this way. These are not, the scribes they're not the people we want to model our lives after right here in this situation. I think where I want to land on today is talking about the Father and then the disciples. Both the Father and the 9 disciples are in different places, and I think they have doubts with this faith thing. The Father seems like a guy who's tried everything to get his son healed, kind of like the woman with the blood issue that gets healed. She's tried everything. He was likely been to every doctor, tried every medicine, all the healing, different ideas. He's been to local religious leaders for some healing ceremonies maybe, and nothing has worked for his son. He goes to Jesus' disciples who are healing people all over the land, and still no relief for his son. His faith is running on fumes. I mean, it's you can imagine how he feels. A bit differently, the disciples are actually following Jesus. They're trying to follow Jesus. They believe, they have seen lots of success, healings, miracles, demons being cast out, but they hit a roadblock. They can't cast out this demon. They face some backlash and start to probably question their belief. Does this ever happen to us? Things are going great, and then all of a sudden you hit a roadblock and you're like, God, did you leave me? Where are you? Things don't go our way, and we've tried everything in our power, but still, maybe our marriage is in a tough place. A family member has a medical condition that seems solutionless. A relationship with a family member is non-existent. You don't have the money to pay some upcoming bills. Or maybe you're like more like the disciples and the Father, and you're riding high and then you hit a speed bump. You don't get the promotion that you were in line for, or you don't get the playing time you think you deserve if you're not, on a team, or your faith wanes. You become less sure. Does God still care about me? These are minor things, these last couple ones, but is he going to come through, or even does he care about me, care about my life? And your faith in him maybe grows a little bit tired. But in this case, Jesus has this Father process this all with him in front of everybody. He lays out this problem, his doubts, his fading belief. As Jesus confronts him and challenges him to believe, he responds with the little bit he has left, the little bit of faith maybe that he had left. I believe, help me with my unbelief. I think one of the biggest killers of faith and belief is unprocessed doubt. Doubt that doesn't see the light, doubt that stays in the darkness to seed more doubt. In our culture, it seems like, are fearful to expose their junk and their unbelief. His father he didn't care. And I think doubt kills your belief. You see, doubt that is processed and discussed with Jesus and maybe trusted believing friends can lead you back to belief. I heard Pastor Bill Johnson say, as your faith builds, it doesn't deny your problem's existence, but it denies the problem a place of influence. Let me repeat that. As your faith builds, it doesn't deny your problem's existence, but it denies the problem a place of influence. It highlights that we have problems, but we don't leave our focus on the problems, but on Him taking over and handling them for us. We all have more than one seed growing in our gardens. Unbelief and faith. Which one are you going to water? Which one are you going to water? Jesus helped the Father process his unbelief, but he didn't condemn him. Instead, he took the faith the Father had and called it out. He also honored his honesty and desire to believe by healing his son. There was a lot of grace in this interaction. There was a lot of grace. And I believe that this is where many of us live. We believe in Jesus, and yet we feel that our faith is weak. How can this be? How can we so easily turn away? And yet this is the very thing we do. Something doesn't go our way all of a sudden, or, a few things don't go our way. And this is where our sinful hearts can pull us away from Jesus. And that's why this Father's request to Jesus is so good for us. His request is so powerful for us. Lord, I believe. I believe. Help my unbelief. And I think that was an honest response. The prayer of faith is a prayer for faith. It's a prayer to the one who can increase the faith. Prayer to the one who can increase the faith. And as we go out today, before we go out, I want us to take a minute. Right where you're at, and maybe think of an area of your life where your faith might be tired, or maybe a area of your life where it's waned. I want you to think of some specific thing, okay? And then just take a minute, and then I'm going to pray for us.